This is on now? Nope. Did I turn it off? I think it's on. Maybe I'm not talking directly. Am I okay now? Good. Thank you. Thank you for those of you that stayed for this session. This is kind of like the warm-up, I guess. First of all, I want to say that when I was invited by April to come and speak, it wasn't a very hard decision at all because I've had previous experience in working in Indian education in Michigan. I was thinking as we were praying this morning a lot about how actually I should be grateful to the Saginaw Chippewa tribe because it's through them that I really began working in Indian education. And the way that happened is that my former husband ended up coming from Turtle Mountain. He was a Head Start director to Mount Pleasant because of wanting to finish his degree, and there was a program at Central Michigan where he could get some credits for his life experiences, and he wanted to finish his degree. And I was a new teacher, and I just went along with him to see his advisor at Central Michigan, and the professor said to me, well, what are you doing for a living or whatever? And I said, well, I'm a teacher. And he said, well, do you have a job? Because we really just moved. We went there sight unseen and made a rash decision to go to Central Michigan. It was really kind of fun. But anyway, I said, well, I have this teaching degree, and I used to teach junior high. And he said, well, we need an Indian culture teacher. And I said, I just swallowed for a minute. And I said, well, he said, I think you'll do. And I said, what do you mean? And the previous Indian culture teacher had gotten married over the summer, and they didn't have someone. And based upon the fact that I had lived and taught on the Turtle Mountain Reservation, and they needed someone, I guess that was how I qualified, okay? So I taught in Mount Pleasant High School, and I was a JOM teacher, and I taught, basically I was hired to teach language arts, but it became very apparent to me that we needed something else. So I was able to convince the school to have an alternative school within the high school. So we actually had a classroom where many of the students from the Saginaw Chippewa tribe went to school in Mount Pleasant High School. And then I also taught language arts. Now, how did that happen? I mean, I think it's always important because you see someone like me and you say, well, how do they come to do what they're doing, or why are you even know what you know? I grew up in southern Indiana, in Vincennes, Indiana, and I am of Miami descent and Irish descent on my mother's side, and English and German on my father's. And so I wanted to teach on a reservation as soon as I got my teaching degree, and there wasn't a reservation school in Peru, Indiana. And so I found a job at Turtle Mountain in Belcourt, North Dakota, and I started teaching. And then I married someone from there, and then it went on from there. Our daughter's enrolled in the Turtle Mountain tribe, and I have stayed very committed to Indian education, to Native American mental health, and I really feel, and that's what drives me to do this kind of work, is being grateful for my experiences and also seeing a great need, and sort of one thing moves on into another. So that's how I got into this work, okay? All right, so what I thought I would try to do today, I know that suicide prevention is a really difficult topic, but I think if we think about it in terms of the outcome being resilience, I mean, there are options. We can go into self-destruction, or we can use a lot of the resources that we have in terms of our socialization, and also in terms of the people that we meet in life and the skills that we pick up, and we can be resilient people. And I think anytime you meet an elder, a Native American elder, you are seeing a resilient person, just given that. So I'm trying to tie those two themes together in this presentation. Okay, so what I thought we would do is that I will go over a set of risk factors for Native American youth suicide. And the reason, what might be a little bit different about this, for those of you that have had many of these trainings or in behavioral health, is that I'll be reviewing the literature on research with Native American youth, not just the general literature, but what we have from studies with Native American youth suicide prevention and suicide. And then share with you a model that we have developed, sort of a theoretical model about why we're focusing on skills interventions, all right, and that kind of a model. It's a stress coping model for suicide prevention. And then I wanted to showcase what I think are some of the best practices in suicide prevention in the 20 years that I've been in it in terms of working with Native youth. Okay. So over the years, just some of the funders, and you'll see up there the Kellogg Foundation, and actually at the time that the American Indian Life Skills Curriculum Manual came out, Valerie Johnson helped me get a small grant from Kellogg, and they gave a complimentary, the book only cost $30, and so they gave a complimentary copy to each and every tribe across the country just to sort of get it out there to people, so I'm thankful to that. The recent work has been pretty much through being subcontracts with grants through the SAMHSA, Substance Abuse and Mental Health Administration, and in which we did a lot of training around the country to try to get this into the field quite a bit. And these are the people whose grants they were on: Dee Bigfoot, Joanne Kaufman, and Danelle Reed Inderbitson in their tribal projects. So those of you who work with Native youth know, I mean, you don't have to answer this question. Why are we worried about this? Because it is so prevalent in Indian communities. And the one that I remember the most is the fact that the completed rate of suicide is 72% more common among American Indian Alaska Native people than the general population. And the way I think about it is, what it helps me remember this is that the rate among adolescents, and we're talking in that 15 to 24-year age range for Native youth, is twice that of those in the mainstream population. But what I've been working with a lot more and very concerned about are early adolescents, younger people. And the rate for children, for Native American children, is 3 times greater than for children within the mainstream population. And I think I had a real wake-up call a few years ago. I was invited to a village in Canada. It was an Anishinaabe community. And a little boy said, he was 8 years old, "I just want to be dead for a little while." And it really got me to think about how, young people sometimes aren't thinking about, the finality of this approach, and it really, got me to focus a lot more with younger kids. Okay, but this graph was published a few years ago in the American Psychologist, and it's an article about culture and youth suicide. And I think it's important that you see on the left-hand side are the cluster are females, and on the right are males. And they're color-coded in this way. The red bars, of course, American Indian, Alaska Native. The next highest would be Latino, Hispanic. And those are the green bars in terms of rates of suicide attempts. And this is in the Youth Risk Behavior Survey. A lot of schools give that survey on a regular basis, and so this is reported out from them in terms of self-reported suicide attempts. And then followed by Asian American, Pacific Islander, and then the blue, which are gray. The blue bars are African American, and the pink bars are white. Okay, that's just the categories that they used in the way they reported out this data. And so we're all interested in trying to understand more, what role does culture play in this behavior? So I'll be going into more detail in a little while about American Indian, Alaska Native, but just to kind of share with you some general things. In terms of the Latino Hispanic population, some of the research that's coming out of grants through the National Institute of Mental Health, Louis Zayas is the PI. He's focusing a lot on the conflict with Latina girls, okay, around traditional gender roles that their families expect them to continue to play, and then the pressures for acculturation among their friends and in larger society, and how it really plays itself out for young girls. With the African American population, Dr. Sean Joe, who's here in sociology at the University of Michigan, he, in a lot of his interviews with African American men, has found that, African American youth, they have great role models in terms of entertainment and athletics, and of course many more people, and Obama and African American people have achieved great things, but when they still have a lot of pressure on them to be very successful or to deal with the pressures of discrimination and racism that they deal with. And when they try to talk to their families about it, or to their parents are saying, listen, you don't have any idea. You don't have anything to complain about now compared to what we went through. So they often feel that their own parents are not very receptive because they don't feel that their children are experiencing the same kind of racism that they did. Okay? With the area of Asian American and Pacific Islander, I know that's gloss in terms of grouping that group together, but there's a woman in San Diego who's done some very interesting work with Filipino families, in which she's had focus groups with parents and their children, and again what they feel is that their parents are working several jobs in order to provide well for the kids. The students are feeling like they are discriminated against in schools, and that they can't talk to their parents because their parents are so stressed out by the multiple jobs that they have that it's unfair for them to complain to them. So it's kind of interesting, the different issues that different cultures bring up. Okay. So I just want to say that I think that ever since we had the school shooting, homicide, suicide at Red Lake, at least it's being dealt with more openly in Indian communities. And Dr. Yvette Robidoux just recently talked again about the impact of suicide in the community. It's saying it sends shock waves. But if you think about it, I mean, it affects everyone in the community, in small communities. Every culture has its gifts and burdens, and I would say that the gift of extended families and closeness is often, it can then flip in a different direction in terms of people being so affected than when someone passes by or dies by suicide in their community because of that closeness. So that also becomes the burden. But it affects people in very, very strong ways. Okay. So just wanted to go over the idea about youth and problems. And the fact that if you think about it, the very first column on the left of problems are probably problems you think that early adolescents experience, right? Problems with their friends and their family, or just beginning to have troubles in school, or first love interest, their girlfriend or boyfriend, not going well, beginning, to get involved in alcohol and drug use, and just the things of lies and rumors and bullying and cyberbullying and the kind of things that they happen and experience. But then what happens is these problems then turn into deeper problems. Binge drinking, unsafe sex, violence, more intense legal problems, etc., which then could be that it's more likely to lead these kind of problems to suicide. And the way I like to think about this is that problems are not additive, they multiply. And so a person who has let's say one problem is 2.3 times more likely to attempt suicide than the person that has no problems at all. Person that has two problems, it moves up to 8.8 times more likely than a person that has no problems. 3 problems, 18.8. 5 problems, 50.0. You see what I'm saying? It gets more and more extreme in terms of the likelihood of problems, and of doing self-destructive behavior. And what we're finding in the attempt literature is there's something critical about moving from 3 problems to 4 problems. A person that has 3 and they're dealing with 3 problems simultaneously are more, if they're plagued by the issue of suicide, might be into more suicidal ideation. But once it moves in more over 3, it becomes very hard to handle it all, and maybe then more into attempts. Marty, were you going to ask a question?
Yeah, I just wondered, is there a difference with completed suicides?
Moving from, I'm not so sure about that because we don't have that post-mortem information very often. Do you see what I mean? But in the literature we have about attempts and ideation, that seems to be a difference. Okay? And so I guess, and the other thing I think about it is that, with these kinds of problems, in a way, it's helpful because, I mean, it's not helpful, but one thing that we know is that a lot of these risk factors are the same for different types of problems. So if we can focus on some of the, the risk factors that are common, we might be able to address many things, such as community violence or school violence or eating disorders, etc. But anyway, the idea that they compound and they're multiple. It's not so easy. Just you're not just solving one problem at a time, most likely. Okay, so the curriculum that I've been working on now for a long time, we've been trying to come up with what we think is a theoretical model because we're moving towards doing randomized controlled trials, and what they ask us all the time is, what do you think in all that you have in this curriculum are the active ingredients? And so we're trying to come across with that. Now I have to say that the way that this curriculum was developed was with the Pueblo of Zuni, and it was at the end of late 80s, early 90s. And the way that we developed it was really to respond to the concerns that they had. And so the curriculum came from that work, and and I'll go into it a little bit more. But basically, what I have in this model, on the left-hand side, are different kinds of risk factors. Like I said, there are many others, but these are the ones that I'm going to talk about today because we have research on that with Native youth. Okay. And so I have the first cluster I call ecological factors. And what I think about those are like, it's in the air. They're just a part of the makeup of the environment. Okay. And so and I'll go into a little bit more, but basically historical trauma, acculturation stress, pervasive poverty. Think about those as a backdrop. They're just there. And then the social factors, the social risk factors of community violence, family disruption, interpersonal problems. And then the ones we typically think of in terms of individual factors are depression, substance abuse, psychological disorder, and I add age and gender in there because I think there are some differences, just as a place to talk about differences in terms of age and gender. Okay, so according to this idea, if a person is moving along about life and they may have some risk factors in their, in their life experiences that would lead them to be vulnerable at times, and so a stressful event occurs. And a person either, that old fight or flight thing. In other words, they respond one way or the other, right? An event occurs. And if they have within their repertoire of coping things that deter them from suicide, such as cultural beliefs against it, a social support system, some knowledge about problem solving, some good people and strong, in that environment, they probably won't. But if they have, on the other hand, easy access to firearms, a dysfunctional family, maybe a culture that has a very permissive attitude about taking one's life, or they have more of these risk factors, then they may be inclined then to commit suicide. That's what people think about it. So what I'm trying to say is, when there is stress, there are often, at least this has been my experience in the work I've been doing with youth for a long time now, is it seems like people can either try to avoid it. Seems like there's a lot of trying to avoid it through self-medication or just not telling anybody or going off and being alone, okay? Or we can try to deal with it and approach it, okay? And so a curriculum like some of the ones I'll talk about today, and the American Indian Life Skills is one, but there are others, try to help people get involved in more approach coping. And that could be problem solving, it could be, praying, it could be telling jokes about it, humor, it could be meditation, it could be, regular exercise, but there's approach versus avoidance coping. And so with avoidant coping, we're talking about maybe self-medication, distancing, not solving problems, and often this leads to thinking negatively about oneself, which then can lead to suicide, right? But in these interventions, what most of these interventions do over and over again is in some way, shape, or form they teach people about better problem solving and about keeping a positive attitude, about staying positive, about having positive thoughts about themselves, which we hope leads to resilience. Okay. Okay, so now we'll just go over the risk factors for a minute. All right. Probably with you all, we don't need to talk about, multi-generational historical trauma because it's now in the mental health field and among people talking, writing about it and talking about it quite frequently. But it's the idea of successive compounding events that are perpetuated on a community over generations to eradicate cultural identity and challenge the culture's right to exist. These are examples. You might say, well, how would you ever measure that? And these are examples of some of the items in some scale development that Tessa Evans Campbell and Karina Walters have come up with. But they've done multiple items, but I gave a few examples because I think it helps to be specific. So you might ask, if you were asked the question, even if I did not experience the trauma when I know other Native people have, I feel the pain too. How many of you might be able to identify with that? Okay. When I hear about other painful tribal histories, I feel a strong connection to them. That's another one. I do not, this is mentioned over and over again, I do not talk much to my family about my problems because I don't want to burden them. It's the idea that, there's enough burden going on here anyway. I don't need to add to what my grandparents have gone through or what my parents are dealing with. But anyway, there are better, and these are just sample items, but there are some good ways to measure it. And in a recent study that's conducted by Whitbeck et al., and he's doing research in the lower, in this area on up into Canada with a particular tribe in the upper Midwest. So he's saying that loss stemming from historical trauma is often on the minds of 1/5 or 20% of Native adolescents in the 11 to 13-year-old age group. About 20.5% of these adolescents report daily or more thoughts about their tribe's loss of land versus 12.4% of their adult female caretakers. Now, I think what's interesting about that is you think, well, the elders would be suffering more from the trauma, but what you see here is young people are, they're just coming into a stage of their political awareness. And so they're experiencing it more. The adults and grandparents and other elders have been more desensitized to it. But young people are experiencing it. So we're saying, 20% of the kids think about this on a daily basis. They think about some kind of political or social injustice associated with being Native American on a daily basis. Okay, so that's one. Okay. There have been many studies about acculturation stress. And I think what's interesting is that we know from the studies with the relocation period, when many people went to the cities, a lot of the anthropologists would talk about how really families didn't change very much because even though people were moved to urban areas, they still maintained ties and went back regularly for ceremonies. And we know, at powwows when this group is multi-generational and that group, you still know them. They might be in Ann Arbor or Detroit or Chicago, whatever, but they still are very identified as being Native people, right? Okay, that is true. But there still is a lot of stress associated with acculturation pressures, and our youth are experiencing it all the time. I think, and because of the internet, as well as TV, there's always the ability to compare oneself to what you see others having, or or the pressure to go into that pace and to do it. So we have a couple studies that are directly related to suicide. One is done by David Lester, and here he's looking at 18 different tribes, and he sees that the suicide rate is positively associated with acculturation stress and negatively associated with being involved in traditional practices. Okay. Another one is by Dr. Phil May, in which he looked at the suicide record in the state of New Mexico, and looked at Apache, Navajo, and then the Pueblo tribes, and he rated them according to the amount of contact they have with mainstream society, and then he looked at the suicide rates, and of course, and he had the very same finding. Those that have more contact with the mainstream society and are more traditional are experiencing, and less traditional are experiencing more suicide. Okay. Poverty. An interesting study with this is a study by Jane Costello, and it's called, she's an epidemiologist, and it's called the Great Smoky Mountain Study. And so at the time she was looking at the rate of psychological disorders within the Appalachian area, the tribe there, one of the tribes there got a casino. So it's called the natural experiment, because she was able to, she was following people over time, and so she was able to compare people that were once poor to people who are poor. And so all they were looking at is the change in their income. Nothing else changed, okay? And so what did they find? They found that among those that were once poor, all right, the conduct disorders of kids in the school really went down, the number, the rate, the number, but it didn't necessarily affect depression within that period of time that she studied. And so she's assuming that it probably takes longer to change depression than it might be to do behavior change, but definitely there was a difference. Also, parents were able to spend more time with their children. There were more marriages within the community because there was a little bit more income, and so it was better. So anyway, that's one example of the difference in no longer being poor, I guess. Yeah. Mm-hmm. I don't think their per cap is as good as some might be around here, but anyway, never mind. Okay, so family and family disruption, dysfunction, and of course, almost every, the classic thing to think about there is the removal to boarding school period of time. And I think what's interesting is that we don't have enough research, though, on the impact of the boarding school experience on parenting behavior. We have a study done in the 70s where mothers who had been in boarding schools were videotaped in their parenting with their children. And what they were doing is they were looking at it from an attachment perspective, because Bowlby and people in attachment theory, they would look at how much a child was distressed whenever the mother went out of view and those kinds of things. And they did see that mothers who had grown up in boarding schools were more anxious about their parenting of young children than others. There's also a really neat study done by Michelle Sarche in which she looked at mothers, teen moms, in a Northern Plains reservation, and just even by interviewing the moms before they had the babies about how they were parented, for them to think about how they were parented, and then looking at them 2 years later, they saw a difference in those that had gotten that interview where they were thinking about how they were parented before having the baby than later. But how were they parented? Well, if your parents didn't have regular experience of being parented rather than in boarding schools, it certainly disrupted that cycle. It was an effective process in terms of destroying challenging Native family. Okay. Community violence. Now with the work on the Department of Justice, we know more that homicide rate for Native people is 70% higher than for whites. The lifetime estimates of domestic violence victimization of Native women is between 50 and 80%. And Native youth are 2 times more likely to experience violent victimization than their non-Native peers. And so we get into bullying. And I think this is an interesting figure. And as I work in some of the schools with the curriculum that I'm doing, I think this is the fear that most educators have, is how to address bullying, because it's really a problem in the schools. But this one study was done by Donald Meichenbaum. Are any of you familiar with him? Meichenbaum is one of the ones that started cognitive behavioral therapy a long time ago. Well, anyway, he was invited to do a consultation in an Inuit village several years ago. And it was when they had discovered that a teacher had sexually abused 85 youth in this village. And so he looked at the suicide rate for Inuit females at the time was 32 per 100,000, and for males it was 119 per 100,000. That was already there in general. But then when he looked at those 85 that had been sexually abused, what he found was their rate was 200 per 100,000. So see the impact of sexual abuse on suicidality? Okay. And then, of course, interpersonal problems. And I don't have a lot of figures here, but I can say that we did do a study a few years ago on suicidal ideation, and certainly how people got along with their peers was a risk factor for suicidal ideation. Okay. Now, what we typically think about is depression and anxiety. And I call it the deadly duo, because a number of years ago we were able to do an analysis of what were factors for middle school age suicidal ideation. And we had financial strain, stress, involvement in culture, a number of them. But what accounted for most of the variance in that was a combination of substance abuse and depression. Okay. And then in terms of anxiety, Costello in her work, she's been able to see that just as we have problems with depression, anxiety is certainly an issue as well. Okay. And then just the fact that these co-occur with substance abuse, and that 90% of suicides in the United States are characterized by both substance abuse and psychiatric disorder. Okay. Now this is interesting, and that is that we have differing views about the extent of psychological disorder among Native youth. Costello and her group in the Great Smoky Mountain Study is saying it's not so bad. But then recent research by Whitbeck in this area has found that 44.8% of 13 to 15-year-olds had a lifetime psychological disorder, and 26.6% had a 12-month disorder. So in their research, they're seeing that this is pretty prevalent in terms of some type of psychological disorder. Okay. And then in terms of age, I guess what I want to say here is that it seems like it's very important. Adolescence obviously is a time of growth, great growth, and no other time in one's development. And we have to think about this a lot. And these quotes are from a study that I did in the Northern Plains a few years ago with middle school age students. And what we did is we asked, first of all, if they'd ever attempted and how long ago and how many times. And then we said, if you'd be willing to share with us what went on, we'd appreciate it. So we just had 3 open lines for them to tell us. And some of them wrote so much they were writing in the margins because they wanted to tell us. And so they would say things like, 6th grade male, I was mad. I was mad. I thought that my mom would be happier if I were dead and they'd all cheer. Now, on the other hand, I will say there were other people that said, I thought about it, but thinking about my family, I didn't do it. Okay, I'm just selectively picking out some quotes here. But I'm trying to get at the thinking, all right? I got in a fight, and I thought I was going to be picked on. So you see, it's becoming a normalized behavior for young children in terms of how they solve problems. Or at least how then they can show to other people, let other people know how much they're hurting. Okay. And then the other part about this in terms of gender is, like the mainstream population, Native girls attempt more than boys, but Native boys use more lethal means, and therefore they complete or die by suicide more frequently than girls. Okay. And then I wanted to add this. We do not necessarily have a study related to suicide per se about this, but almost every time that I give this presentation, an elder will say that they think that it has a lot to do with just being not really living one's spirituality or knowing who they are, youth knowing who they really are. Okay. All right. Mm-hmm.
There, part of the idea of the spiritual bankruptcy, I've heard things you wouldn't find in the DSM manual, but they happen in Native communities, and we have these explanations. Are you finding that that is common in your work?
Well, what I'm finding is that we're now able to have better ways to measure it, right? And so, see, in my work, I don't necessarily use the DSM because I'm doing survey research, but definitely. And so that this does occur. And what happens with the DSM, unfortunately, is that it doesn't really outline these very much. In the current one, there's like a glossary at the back, but we don't really train. Now, with more Native psychologists, people are identifying this a lot more. I would agree with you, yes, I would. Okay, I'm just saying that there is some frustration that we don't have a better way of measuring it, and that it isn't measured more widely. Yeah, okay. But that's a really good question. Okay, so what I thought I'd do is just mention what I think are some good practices. And for those of you, if you're familiar with the NREP database, that's the National Registry of Effective Programs. For those of you that have federal programs, sometimes you're required to do that. And these are on there. So I'll go through each one just briefly. The American Indian Life Skills, the one that I've been working on, the book is supposedly here. People, if they want to buy it, they can get it, or someone's selling it, I guess. Or it's going to be in the bookstore, I'm not sure, but we'll know a little bit more later on. I think the person's kind of lost on campus or something. But anyway, there is this curriculum. But what I've been working on now for the last few years is developing and refining a middle school version, because of the fact that the emphasis is really on. Oh, okay, great. It's back there if you'd like to get one. Thank you. Okay. And so that book is been found to be very effective with high school age, but with the middle school group. We've been developing and refining and evaluating a middle school version because of the fact that I think that we really need to pay attention to younger people and to really try to prevent this behavior before it becomes more automatic for people. And so I'll go into it a little bit more. But basically, the emphasis is on skill building, but it's not just suicide prevention. It's about building life skills so that people don't think that they have to get to that point in terms of how to handle their situation. And then it teaches youth about how to help if their friend is suicidal, how to be able to talk to them, how to be able to recognize and actually ask the question. It's kind of like a gatekeeper's training for young people. And it's very simple in that as soon as you realize that the person is suicidal, you don't if you've promised secrecy, you have to break that promise, and you have to say, I can't keep a secret, and I want to go with you to somebody to help. And it isn't going necessarily always to therapy or to counseling. It's I need to get you to a trusted adult so that we can work on this. And so it's an automatic referral. Okay. So the curriculum is basically it's 7 sections, and the numbers in parentheses are how many lessons are for each of these. And so the beginning of it is helping build a sense of safety in the classroom or in a group if you're using it. And what is confidentiality, and what is respect, and how do we do that, and how do we trust people. And then we get into emotions and stress, and there are 8 lessons in that. And then we get into communication skills and problem solving, and there are 5 lessons in that. Then we have 4 lessons on self-destructive behavior. And then the lighter ones, they should be brighter. But 5 and 6 then are the suicide prevention sections. So there's a big buildup before you get to 5 and 6. And in 5 and 6 is 4 lessons on why do people attempt suicide, and 6 is how do I help a friend who's thinking about suicide. And there are 3 lessons on that. So they practice a 4-step plan. And then the last is how do I plan ahead for a great future, and there are 8. And the reason we have 8 is because we want people to leave that experience thinking about their future, being upbeat, being, very forward-thinking, and so it's a real kind of uplifting thing. So if you were to use it in a classroom, what I would recommend is that it's used in a classroom that's required class for all students, so that everyone would get it while they're in high school. So sometimes people will give it in freshman language arts classes because everyone takes language arts, or in social studies class, or in health class. But the idea being that everyone would get it at the beginning of their high school experience, and then in their junior year, they might get a booster session. They would have a couple practice sessions of going over the 4-step plan again, which is the suicide prevention plan. Okay. It could be for all schools.
Could you repeat the question?
The question is, I think, is it just for tribal schools or is it for the public? It could be used in all of those. Yes, it is. I mean, it's being used quite a lot in a variety of places. All right. Yes. And actually, we've used it in East Palo Alto with no native students. All right. But the students are all students of color. And East Palo Alto is predominantly Hispanic population and Pacific Islander. And there's some people from recent immigrants from Nigeria and Somalia. So Samoans, Tongans, African Americans, Nigerians. You see what I mean? And so people would say, well, why do you think it works? And what I understand, because we've used it, with 8th graders, I've done it with groups of girls, and I've worked with psychiatry team that did it with the boys, and the psychiatrists said they think it's because it has a relational orientation, and that most of the students from those communities still have a relational way of being, and so they like it, because it's really emphasizing a lot the community and their role in the community, the fact that you have a contribution to make, and that the community doesn't want you to take your life, we need you, etc. Okay, thank you. So anyway, so the main skills that are taught over and over again are positive thinking and problem solving, and they're repeated in each of those sections. So we might learn how to handle depression through problem solving around what things I want to do that I like to do, because we have a thing on depression busters, and it's just a list of things that you already like to do. And people check it off, and they have little cards about their 5 things that they like to do. And so it might be that. Or it might be around thinking differently and being more positive and getting myself out of a negative spiral into a positive spiral. So you see we do that, or stress management through problem solving and positive thinking. So we try to keep reinforcing those 2 main skills over and over again, applied to different kinds of things. Okay, so how effective is this? Because now we have to talk about the effectiveness of things. And really the reason that this curriculum is in the NREP website is because we did evaluate it. We were lucky that we were able to evaluate it when we developed it at Zuni. So when we developed it with people at Zuni, we did it over 3 years. We spent a year developing it, we spent a year pilot testing it, and then we spent a year in the final evaluation. And this is the final evaluation. So we evaluated it with freshman students and some junior students, almost evenly between boys and girls, or high school students. Now, what's important, if you look at that 81% of the freshman students, okay, were in the moderate to severe range on suicidal ideation. I think this is important because when we were first asked to do this, there's a committee at Stanford. It was called the Stanford Zuni Committee. And I went before them telling them what I wanted to do, and the faculty had to, approve whether I did it or not. And I really felt like I went through my second dissertation because they were nervous about us doing this. And they were saying to me, are you sure that it's really a problem out there? I mean, are you just trying to look for a project kind of thing? I said, no, this is the reason they had asked me is there had been 5 deaths by suicide in their high school the year before. And it was a community at that time of only 9,000 people. Okay, so it was really affecting them. Okay, so 40% of the freshmen and juniors in the study had a relative or friend that committed suicide, and 18% reported that they had already attempted suicide. These are high school freshmen. Okay. So what did we find? What we did is we had classes that received the curriculum, classes that didn't, and we compared the classes that did to the ones that didn't. Right? And what we found is that those that received the curriculum were less hopeless, and they were more confident about their ability to manage anger. And then in a behavioral study, we randomly selected the students in both groups, and they went through role-playing with a friend, a friend how to 2 problem-solving scenarios and 2 suicide prevention scenarios. And that was very interesting because as a Zuni person, they were not allowed to role play being suicidal. So I was at the University of Wisconsin at the time, so I brought out 2 students that were young, 2 Native students that were young looking, and they were Confederate clients, and they role played being the suicidal person for this study. And that was how they were able to do it. And we found that it improved their suicide prevention skills and their peer problem-solving skills, as evaluated by 3 Native American trained raters. Okay. Now, another source of evidence is that after we evaluated it in New Mexico, we went to Sequoia High School, which is in Tahlequah, Oklahoma, Cherokee Nation. And it just so happened that there was a study going on at the time. It was a longitudinal study of Indian boarding schools. And Sequoia High School is a boarding school that was being conducted by the National Center for American Indian Alaska Native Mental Health Research. And so they were able to look at the rate of attempts and gestures before we even started, and then look at if there was any difference after the curriculum was implemented. And so this is from a report by the National Academy of Sciences, and they reported that there was a reduction in the 20-year suicide rate and that there had been no deaths by suicide from the time it was implemented until they reported out to the people in this report. Now, this is really a neat study, and this was done in the Southwest, and it's called a public health approach to suicide prevention. And what they did in this community is that they did everything. They improved, they beefed up everything in their community. It's a small village in New Mexico. And so first of all, they increased their surveillance. They got better at their data keeping. They got clear, that it's important that we really do report these as suicides when they happen, because a lot of times people don't want to report it, and the coroner will act like it's something else and all that kind of thing. So they were much more stringent about that. They did screenings, and they did it in places where the youth hung out. So in the bush, or what, I don't know what you call it here, but where people hang out at the lake, at the powwow or at a regular dance or school event or whatever. They were there, and they did screenings. They also trained natural helpers. And so often, instead of only thinking about elders or adults as natural helpers, they also train neighbors as natural helpers. They train youth as natural helpers. So they did that. And then they also had, I don't want that. Okay. They had the American Indian life skills in the school, and then they also did counseling as normal and the behavioral health, and they used the natural helpers. So they basically just mobilized the community around this. Now, what did they find? Okay, this was in the Journal of Public Health, and so what they reported is that when they started this effort, this comprehensive effort in 1988, the solid black square is suicide attempts. So they had 40 incidents in this village when they started in 88, and it went down, and then it went up, and then it sort of went down and stayed plateaued, and then it went up. But basically, by the time they reported it out for this journal article, it was down to 4. So from 40 in 88 to 4 in 2002, significant. Okay. And then in terms of gestures, they had 30 that recorded gestures in 88, 89, and then when they reported out here, it was about 7. And then the lower level are the ones that are actually completions. And you don't see much change there, but it's not a high-frequency behavior. That's why for most of these studies, it's hard to say, are we reducing suicide, all right? Because we don't have enough numbers, really, to look at significance. But we look then instead at something that's proximal to that, and that is the attempts and ideation. But this is good results. Okay. By the way that they reported it at the hospital. Okay, so cutting, maybe hanging that didn't happen. You see what I mean? Now there's a technical way in which they have this, I guess I would say maybe more severity. Yeah, like probably hanging and then the cutting would be considered more severe than pills, and saying it, just saying I did it, but actually showing up to the clinic for it becomes a little bit more severe. Okay, thank you. All right. So then this is to bring home, so this is like, where are we? And so a few years ago, I was able, many people would ask, does the Red Book, the high school version, is it relevant for middle school students? And I would say some of the lessons are, and because we had asked that question at Sequoia High School, we'd have the teachers, they gave us feedback on every lesson at Sequoia High School, and one of the items was, do you think this lesson is relevant at the middle school level as it stands? Is it appropriate and relevant? And the ones that they said they were, we put an asterisk next to it in the table of contents. And I would say, I feel comfortable telling people, well, this is what the teachers told us. All right. So but then I thought, well, I better put it to a test. So I was able to do a randomized controlled trial here now, and this was a few years ago, and it was the community of Northern Plains. All right, and this is with middle school students. And so what I did is I compared the American Indian Life Skills with another intervention called Reconnecting Youth, if any of you have ever heard of it. It's very much problem-solving and self-monitoring curriculum by Leona Eggert, and a control group. And we were able to randomize. But what's important about this slide is at pretest, these are middle school kids, 11 to 15 years of age, 19.6% reported that they had already attempted. And of those, they didn't go to the hospital. Look, 96.1% did not go to the reservation clinic, did not go to the hospital, or did not see a doctor. So what's happening is they are attempting, but they're not telling anybody. And one of the reasons they don't want to tell anybody is because they're afraid that they will be sent away if they tell anybody. Because many reservation hospitals might have a bed, one bed. They might have a nurse that's nervous about it and doesn't even want to put somebody in that bed over the weekend, right? Some communities, they put the person in jail for a 72-hour hold. And so that's one of the problems that we have, is that we don't, I don't know what the situation is here, but we don't have enough services for somebody when they actually indicate that they need help, if they need to be observed for 72 hours. Okay, but that's what we found. So that's why we think we need curriculum like this in the school, because we're not going to we can't rely only on who shows up at the hospital, because it's a lot more prevalent than that. And then you can see that of those that attempted, 21.5% were boys. Again, were girls, more girls than boys. 10.8% had attempted once, but almost 6% had attempted twice, almost 3% had attempted 3 or more times. And this data was collected in February, so it was right after, it was, in winter, long time indoors, after the holidays. And so 6.9% had attempted in the last month, and 2.9% had attempted in the last 6 months. So these are middle school students. Okay. Now, I have to tell you, people say, why do you even present this slide? But it's important that when we compared American Indian Life Skills to this other curriculum, Reconnecting Youth was more effective. And I think that's important, because we have options. There are many options, and this is an effective one. So Reconnecting Youth, which is, you can look on the web and you'll find it. Basically, what I want to show you is that pre-test, there was significant change in hopelessness. At pre-test, the mean score was 4.78. At post-test, and this is after only 6 weeks of twice a week sessions, and they were 35 minutes each. Okay? So we're talking 12 35-minute sessions. The hopelessness went down to 3.5, and at 10-month follow-up, it was 2.4, and that is significant. From 4.78 to 3.5 to 2.4. So over time, it held. Also, in terms of suicidal ideation, the suicidal ideation, which ranged from 0 to 90, at pre-test it was 14, at post-test it was 6.8, and at 10-month follow-up it went all the way down to 3.7. So that's very significant. So I write letters for Reconnecting Youth grant proposals, and I tell people this and that kind of thing. And I learned a lot about how to make a better curriculum. Okay, so we've been developing this middle school version. It's only 30 lessons, and it's 35-minute sessions because we can't get in schools for very long. Okay, and basically we are developing a lot with that. So this is another source of evidence, and this is for the high school version, and I had nothing to do with this study. It was so neat. This was done last year when I was doing a training at Zuni. 3 Navajo ladies from Shiprock came, and so they were excited after the training. They decided they wanted to do it in their schools. So what they did is they narrowed the high school curriculum down to 10 lessons, and they gave it to students to 90 Navajo students in the schools there. Half of them were Navajo primary language speakers. And what did we find? What did they find? Okay, what they found is that there was a significant reduction in hopelessness. There was a significant reduction in suicide risk. And they measured something called public collective esteem. And that is what the students believed other people thought about their race or ethnicity, which I think is kind of interesting. And it was significant, and it went up. Their self-efficacy went up, and their self-awareness went up at the .001 level. Okay, so this is their study of the effectiveness of 10 sessions with high school students on the Navajo Reservation. Okay. So any questions about that before I go into these other programs? I feel like I'm boring you with all this. Am I? Probably, huh? Yes, thank you. Mm-hmm. Okay, very good question. A lot. The question is, do I find resistance when we're trying to implement this in schools? Yes, I do. But what happens is, usually we have already been invited by the tribe. And it's because there's a tribal council resolution that then the school will listen to us and begin to and decide. Okay, a lot of times they don't feel like they have a choice. Okay, but what I try to say, and this is where we need to have, I'm on the Native American Task Force for Suicide Prevention, and we're trying to insist that all tribal schools have a suicide policy. And you see, really, schools can be liable if they know of a student who is suicidal and they don't provide any intervention or any services. And that is the policy across the country in a lot of schools. So usually it's the superintendent that's worried about this, because the school could be held liable if people in the school know and there isn't anything available to the youth. Okay, but so if we could get tribal schools to have written suicide policies, that would be a really good step. But what I try to say is this, and this is a very important point that I hope I'll mention in the keynote, and that is that we know that now we have data that says that youth who are involved in social, emotional, developmental learning, which this is, because it's not just suicide. Remember, there's problem solving, stress management, anger management, depression management, but basically they're learning social, emotional development, self-regulation. That youth that get involved in these kind of interventions, they can see achievement gains as much as 10 points on standardized test scores among youth that do that and not. And it's becoming, we're getting the message out to people so that more educators do realize that. So what I always try to say is, look, we can prove academic gains. We definitely prove school belonging. We measure school belonging, a psychological sense of school membership. And it's hard with grades because grades can be, inflated, or they could be depressed. In one of the schools I'm in, I couldn't believe it when I saw, and I was entering the data this summer, most of the students reported that they got C's and D's. And I was saying, this doesn't seem right. Why would, so they were being honest. They got C's and D's. They didn't think anything about it. But the reason they were getting C's and D's is that they were tying tardiness. They were docking their grades for them being tardy for classes. Okay, so they were very bright. They were, probably had much, they were probably producing a lot more academic work, but they were losing a lot of points because they were being teenagers. And so, so we have a hard time about how to do it. So that's why, in a way, the standardized tests are another measure that we can use to see about the impact of it in terms of academic gains. So that's one of the ones I push, is I start sending them literature about academic gains as a result of social emotional learning.
What about
Public schools, yeah. Yeah.
you find no resistance there?
No, not necessarily. I think it depends upon the administrators and how open they are to the idea of educating the whole child, versus, not. But, what they see in this is they see this is a curriculum. And what I do is I'll tell them, we can map these on to your language, your state standards for language arts. And I get one of my research assistants to go get the state standards, and then we look at BIE standards, and we show where the curriculum meets those standards at this age level. And we give them a written report on that. I mean, we try everything we can. Because, I have the one thing I wanted to say about my experience with Saginaw Chippewa's students and Mount Pleasant High School is that I moved from being a language arts teacher to being a psychologist as a result of that. And I guess it just became clear to me that I felt like I could make a difference more if I ever had a chance to go back for a PhD if I went into psychology. So what I have done is, as a counseling psychologist and as a former school teacher, and knowing that Native kids are not going to go to behavioral health very often or to go to a counselor very often, that's how I started situating the interventions in schools. It's been hard, but I've done it that way because I feel like that's the avenue with which to try to reach kids that we won't be able to have if we only rely on therapy.
So how would you recommend or suggest to parents, social workers,
Okay, so the question is, how could you, it's a great question, how would you recommend then that someone try to get this implemented in schools? One, to find out what they have, how to make it happen in terms of implementation. Well, first of all, I just asked, can I have a copy of your suicide policy? And then the people will look at you with a blank face, probably. And you could just say, well, I just wonder as a parent, what is this, what happens? What do we do if that were to happen? Because I understand from my children or my nieces and nephews that this is something that kids are dealing with. And so what does the school do? Because something that's very important about having a policy is that, I don't know if you've seen this happen, but sometimes when a youth does take their life, depending upon who the family is, some families really have big memorials, and there's a lot going on in the school around it. I've seen schools where kids maybe have a T-shirt with a picture of the student on there. And so there needs to be a decision before anything ever happens about, if it were to happen, how do we handle it? Because then people are consistent in what they do, so it isn't that some kids get more attention than others, because it's not, it's really very painful for those kids that are considered the have-nots that don't have a way to have that happen, So what is the standard policy if it were to happen, and what do we do if we know that this is a very prevalent problem and we need to meet the needs of our students? And then and so you can have your parent committee start to ask, can we have, we want to work on a suicide a suicide policy, and that'll start the ball rolling there. Okay, but then I also think it would help if the tribal council would be, and usually they will respond when there have been deaths in the community. And sometimes, when there's an election, they campaign on different issues, and they can do that. All right. So then what I would do is I would then have a training. And to me, and with the trainings, what I do is I try to encourage anybody, basically I'd have at least an orientation at the beginning of the year so that every, the bus driver, the cooks, everyone in the school knows we're doing this curriculum. All right? Because the more they know about what is going on, it won't become so stigmatized, right? And then I would, try to train as many people that are interested, and then I wouldn't try to draft people. That's the other thing that often happens, is that principals may say, well, we're going to have this person and that person and that person do this class. And I like the idea that you train people, and then the people that are really naturally interested in it will emerge from the training, and then you can see who to try to ask to be doing this kind of work, and then try to build that into their work. We've done things where we've provided incentives. People, where the school might give them extra bonus because they're trying something new. Or we've had where we have what do you call it, like a miscellaneous cash fund, because every teacher needs supplies, so that just things for the incentives. Okay? All right, thanks. Okay. All right, so now, any other questions about that, and then I'll go on to the other programs?
I have one question related to language. Has language been a factor or factored into any of this work that's been done, and whether it has any bearing on the increase or decrease of suicides or attempts, whether it's urban or res level, tribal level?
So you're asking does it make a difference if you speak their traditional language, their tribal language? They could have done it in the San Juan because they had half of their students are Navajo speakers. They didn't, okay, and I didn't do that study, but that was one where they could do it, right? Now, some ways that we have, so no, I don't know that answer yet, but I think it will be studied because, it's a part of what I'll be talking about in the keynote, which is the fact that culture and enculturation, being more steeped in one's culture, is definitely a protective factor. And we know that. We have hard evidence of that now. A few studies, hard evidence. The way we do bring language into it is this, and that is that we have one lesson on depression, in which there is research with the Hopi people about different words that they use to describe a person who is depressed. And then we ask the youth to talk about how in their community they might know that certain people are depressed. And then how might you what words, in your language might you use? Because, there's one about like turning face against the wall. I mean, that's what the translation is. But, there are different words that people have. So they start to think about language that way. Okay, that's one. The other is when we have people that are interventionists who speak the language, right? That's really powerful, especially if the youth speak the language. And so often what happens is they will speak, when they start to want to talk about something that is important to them, if they are language speakers, they often go back, they go into their language, their native language. And then it's what I'm told is that they express themselves better. It's more clear what they're talking about. And so like when we did this first evaluation at Zuni, we had classroom teachers who were not Zuni members, but we had Zuni tribal members that were language speakers team teach with them. And the youth would just automatically, when they wanted to talk about something that really mattered to them, they would automatically speak in Zuni to the Zuni person. And so it was kind of a way that they had their own privacy, at least from the outsider wasn't hearing it. So, I mean, we have accommodated language, and not really accommodated, we're thankful when it happens that we can use language in that way. Okay. Thank you. All right. Any other questions? Yes.
Would you recommend using the middle school and the high school curriculum?
Yeah, so what we're hoping would eventually happen is that we would use the middle school version and then maybe a booster in high school. So I think if when we find out, now what we did this year, we did a randomized trial with middle school students at Zuni. And we're just waiting to get the results. I've spent the summer with my students cleaning the data and all that, and I was hoping we'd have the results by today so that I could tell you I'm supposed to get it Saturday, how it goes. But we are, we're trying to get that. I won't put the middle school version out until we really do have significant results. Okay? But right now the high school version is available. And then, of course, if a community would like to be involved in an evaluation at the middle school level, then we would work with you and would love to work with you at more refinement of that. Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks. Okay. All right, so other curricula. All right, this one is done by the people. This is the same people that created the Reconnecting Youth. And they've created another version, a different, more specific to suicide. It's called CAST, Coping and Support Training. Okay? And so they do the same thing where they focus on life skills and social support in small groups. This is more for, they prefer that the students be considered at risk before they're actually in this, whereas American Indian Life Skills is a universal curriculum. We believe that there's so much of this going on that every youth is somehow exposed through either family members or community member to suicide, and therefore we don't want to just choose youth that are considered at risk. But they use the at-risk idea here. And it can be offered by many different people: nurses, counselors, teachers. And the goal is to increase mood management, improve school performance, and decrease drug involvement. And really, I've been trained in this, and I've seen it. And the way they do it is, youth, they monitor their own behavior. They monitor whether they're absent from class. They have graphs, whether they've used substances. I mean, basically, they get into self-monitoring. And of course, in the group, they discourage them from using substances. They're not encouraging it at all. But they're saying, write down what you really did, keep the graphs, etc. They do that, and they learn a lot about problem solving, and they do group problem solving in every session. It's very good. Okay. The next one is called Sources of Strength. Now, this is one that is just coming out, but it was the thing that's neat about it. It was developed at United Tribes in Bismarck, and now they're evaluating it. It was developed in Native communities in North Dakota, and then but they haven't evaluated it in Native communities. They've gone to Connecticut. So they took what was obviously Indian out of it, but still the foundation is, all right, and they're evaluating it in the state of Connecticut. I asked them, why didn't you evaluate it, like in North Dakota? And they said because of the resistance to research, and they were able to get into schools quicker in Connecticut than in North Dakota. Okay, so it emphasizes a lot about empowerment and gives strength messages, and a lot about coping. And they teach peer leaders, a lot about the suicide intervention, and they do a lot with adults. So it's all these strength messages, and it's really neat. And so, and it's really kind of like a mini gatekeeper thing. They teach the peer leaders how not to promise, how to help a suicidal friend and break the code of silence. They can't keep silence about if they know a friend is hurting and that kind of thing. And these strength messages, and it's seeming to work pretty well. They've been able to get results in terms of mood management and things like that. Okay. And then, it looks like I got rid of I didn't mean to eliminate one. Another one is Teen Screen. Are you familiar with that? All right, now this is a screening tool. It's developed from Columbia University Teen Screen. And again, this is a very simple paper and pencil or computer instrument. And the idea here is that every student would get it. And so you would know whether or not certain students are suicidal or not. And it's been used in Indian communities, and people are trained that like it. Problem with it is that if you are actually finding it out, then you are ethically obligated to be able to provide the services. So if you don't have the services, you shouldn't be using the Teen Screen. But I would suggest those other alternatives: CAST, Sources of Strength, and then of course American Indian Life Skills. That's where I am with that. Okay. So just wanted to go over the main models. The difference between the middle school version and the high school version really is around this. We teach them how to solve problems, and this is a model that we did not create. Stephen Schinke did, and he gave us permission to use it in the curriculum. It's called the SODA. So if you have a problem, what do? You go get a soda. And so you stop, acknowledge the feelings. The options. What are your options? Look at what the options are. Decide on one of those options and evaluate it, and then act on it. So that's the model. Then that's for all problem solving. And then for the high school version, they learned this, which is called the 4-step plan. And that is, if you're talking to your friend, find out what their feelings are. If they seem to be upset about something, try to narrow down, well, what's wrong? What's happened? What's the problem? Then you try to help them figure out, well, who could we go to solve this problem? Or who could we go to? Like if you find out that the person's suicidal, who can we talk to? And we try to get away from the idea that you're going to automatically go to a counselor or go over to IHS or whatever. But who can you trust? And so it might be an aunt, it might be the cook, it might be one of your teachers, it might be your aunt, or one of the people in your spiritual group, whatever. And then the idea is you take them to that. The action is, I'll go with you to that person. Let's go now. So that's what they learn. So what we learned is that middle school youth only need to learn one system. Okay? We can't ask them to do these two things or to different. It's too much. And so what we've done is we went back to SOTA at the middle school level, and so we call it SOTA for suicide prevention. So we basically just apply this problem-solving model to the situation of suicide. And we don't have them exploring resources or anything. We just have them getting their friend to a trusted adult. Okay? Yes?
In your experience, have you found any curriculum or pieces of curriculums that would be well-suited to summer school or camps?
This has been used in camps. You see, what you could do, people have asked me at times, what do you think are the critical must-do lessons? And so I can tell you, I've got a handout, like the 12 critical lessons. And so what I would do is I would say you could choose within those lessons, tailor it to meet the needs of how long you have and what you think the students or the youth issues are. It's been used in camps. It's been used in small groups, therapy groups, treatment groups. Yes. We're using the Reynolds Hopelessness Scale for children at the middle school level. In the Zuni evaluation, we use the Colin Gill. No, the Beck Hopelessness Scale. We use Beck at the high school level. Mm-hmm. Yes? About 5 more minutes? Okay. Mm-hmm. Anything else? Any other questions? Got about 5 more minutes.
With the people coming from families that have boarding school survivors still in them or subsequent generations. I know this personally for me, my mom, my grandfather were boarding school attendees, and I know several people in here probably have the same story. What are you, besides I know you had a slide that showed that the youth, because they're coming into this knowledge, they tend to have a little more anxiety about loss of land. But are you finding that they still have that anxiety about the boarding school experience, that the youth are more anxious about it than the people who actually went through it now?
Well, what it is it's not so much about the experience. I mean, their elders experienced it, okay? But it's the trauma stories, okay? In other words, people, you don't want, I really think a pervading thing is not wanting to burden others. My folks have got so much going on. They're unhappy. We're always worried about everything. And so just sort of like trying to, as a budding, emerging adult, trying to handle your own problems, and not to burden others. And so taking on things that maybe you shouldn't have to take on at that age in terms of responsibilities.
Like I personally felt guilt about not wanting to help my mom with her boarding school issues. And I wonder if, the other kids have experienced that same kind of guilt about not wanting to deal with our parents or grandparents' demons.
It could certainly be one, right? Yeah, and feeling badly about that. And it's survivor guilt. It didn't happen to me. It happened. Look at what my mom, or my grandmother, or my grandfather went through. And hey, I skated. It's a different time. And, and feeling, thankful on one end, but then on the other, like that doesn't seem right. Yeah. So what are we doing with that? One of the things in the curriculum is we do talk about, and we hated to do this because between the pilot test and the second version of it, one of the teachers, it was really actually neat. One of the teachers at Zuni said, "Teresa, you're smart, you're students, you've got great ideas, but this curriculum isn't enough fun." I said, "Oh, okay." And I said, "Well, what do you suggest we do?" And she says, "Well, I can help you redo it." And so she came and stayed with me for a summer, and we totally rewrote the curriculum between the first year and the second year. And she was a drama teacher, and she had high energy, and she wanted to make it more fun. And I think that's one of the reasons why it is as good as it is. I have to say that. But one of the things that she was trying to say, I'm trying to remember where I was going with that now. Just a minute, I lost it. I had a real good. It's about. They also said we need to add sections in here about what is self-destructive behavior and what is a dysfunctional family. And I'm saying why? Because I didn't want to go into that negativity. And she's saying because a lot of the youth are thinking that there's something wrong with them. There's something wrong with them. And so we need to get a better part about the context. Like, what is it that people, it's understandable that you are going through this, or that, that young people go through this, given these other risk factors. Or, it's understandable that it might be hard for you, given the fact that, you miss your real dad, and you don't like the guy that your mother's with right now. That's okay. So kind of getting a little bit more at the reality. And so that's the way we bring it in, is that we try to bring in as much as possible the real life situations that kids have and say, okay, now, how do you handle that? Just like with the stress management, we have a visualization about your sanctuary. And the sanctuary is a place that you can go to in your mind where you feel safe. And, and you design what's in there, what do you like, what do you have. Now, why do we do that? Because people live in crowded conditions and don't have space. So in other words, that's kind of the way that we try to work on those issues.
A common phenomenon in our summer camps seemed to be that children feel guilty that they're not at home dealing with the social problems. They're out here having fun with us, and they feel guilty about it. They want to go home and have no fun.
So we see, that's why we work on the positive thinking. Okay, yes, it'll be there for you when you get back. Okay, so now let's think about what you're getting out of this experience, and let's see if we can try to turn that around and work with. So we try to teach them ways to turn it around so that they're thinking about something that's good for them right now. Because the stronger you are when you go back, the better you're going to be able to help. Okay. Yeah. It's very interesting. All this is very interesting. And so I guess what I would hope that you get too from this is that, that yes, we have 2 out of 7 sections that are on suicide prevention, but we have all this other social emotional development work that goes into, that precedes it and follows it, so that it's really more about all of that. Yes?
As any part of the building and the website, I know that when the native children more important than non-native children of the school, has that been looked at? The roles of the health concerns and everything that program?
Oh, I'm sure it has. I didn't, I haven't seen a specific study related to Native youth about it, but it probably contributes, yes. Thank you. Okay, well, we don't need to keep you much longer. Maybe you want a nice break. I'm kind of getting a little weak here, so I better get recharged for the next one. But thank you very much for listening to this today, and I'd be glad to work with you if you ever decide you would like to, implement the curriculum. I also have a number of people that have trained with me that I could recommend that could come out and work with you as trainers, and I wish you luck in what you're doing. Thank you.